Na maafisa wa shirikisho la waajiri nchini FKE wameandaa kikao na wanahabari kuzungumzia swala la ongezeko la bei ya mafuta ya petroli. Tusikize yanayojiri.
Spending have led to low confidence in public programs. The government suffers from high trust deficit and low confidence by the citizens. The government needs to focus on delivering results in the programs already underway. In addition, the government needs to drastically reduce wastage in public spending. On the legislative changes, there are several legislative changes that have far-reaching implications to Kenyans and employers. Some of the bills currently under discussion are: 1, the Social Health Insurance Bill 2023, 2, Primary Health Care Bill 2023, 3, Facility Improvement Financing Bill 2023, 4, Digital Health Bill 2023, and 5, the Employment Amendment Bill 2022. On the proposed University Healthcare Bill 2023, the efforts to provide universal healthcare in Kenya is noble, and the Federation supports the overall objective of granting every person in Kenya their fundamental right to healthcare. The challenge has been establishing a viable funding mechanism for the universal healthcare. The current model puts the burden on the formal workers and employers, which will lead to increased business costs, reduce employee take-home pay, and destabilize the labor sector. FKE holds the view that this model will face challenges given that the formal wage employment is only 15% of the total wage employment. The envisioned contribution by every Kenyan also poses major challenges. As envisioned by the Constitution and the tripartite labor sector arrangements, the Federation champions meaningful stakeholder engagement, including the government, employers, workers, healthcare providers, and other stakeholders in the health sector, insurance sector, and the public to gain support and ownership. FKE appreciates the efforts made by the Minister of Health to seek stakeholders' views and hopes that employers' views as submitted to the Ministry of Health regarding the proposed bills will be taken into consideration, and the universal health coverage proposed bills amended to capture the views of employers before being passed by Parliament. For example, the Federation noted with concern that the formal employers have been omitted from the board, yet we play a critical role. Employers are central to the provision and implementation of this healthcare as envisioned in this bill, and have always served on such boards alongside trade unions and the government. The authority will largely depend on the contributions of employees in formal employment. This means that accurate deduction and timely remission of these contributions will be done by employers, hence the need for employers' representation on the board. Kenya has ratified ILO Convention 144 on tripartite consultations and hence recognizes the tripartism engagement. Hence, the labor sector representation is not complete when you have only government and workers without employers. Further, the bill refers to employers under various sections, and it's clear that employers' role is envisaged in the bill. FKE should therefore be part of the board. The Labor Relations Act recognizes tripartism in the labor sector. This should not be disregarded in the UHC reforms. This morning, we also woke up to the news that the National Assembly has reduced publication days for the Digital Health Bill 2023 and Social Health Insurance Bill 2023 from the 14 days to 6 days for the Digital Health Bill and 3 days for the Social Health Insurance Bill. This will obviously compromise the quality of public participation. On the Employment Amendment Bill, The bill seeks to amend the Employment Act 2007 by providing for the right to disconnect to employees. In essence, the bill seeks to establish the right of an employee not to be contacted by the employer beyond the contracted working hours unless there is an emergency. FKE does not support the proposed Employment Amendment Bill 2022 for the reasons that, one, the proposed amendments introduce radical and stringent measures that will curtail the employer's prerogative to manage enterprises and pose challenges to industrial relations in Kenya. These proposed changes negate the essence of freedom and the realities of the labor market. The employer's administrative prerogative should not be curtailed by legislation. The changes, in our view, infringe on the employer's right to manage the enterprise on a day-to-day basis. 3, if passed, the bill will create two centers of managerial power and ultimately cause disharmony and indiscipline in the workplaces. The ILO has provided instruments which have been successful in managing working hours and overtime payment. 4, the bill is too prescriptive and requires that employers develop policies to regulate phone usage by employees outside work hours. An employee has the right to keep their phone on or off if it's a personal phone. If the phone is an official one, then the employee is under obligation to use it as required by the enterprise. If the nature of the business requires a shift system or extension of working time to meet the business demands, then such laws which are prescriptive in nature will hamper flexibility in work arrangements. 5, the payment of overtime is already provided for in law under the General Wages Order to address situations where employees work beyond the set hours. Most collective bargaining agreements provide for flexibility in the management and regulation of working time. To our knowledge, no union or employee has raised any concerns to warrant the passing of this law. 6, flexibility is important for the labor sector in the new normal, which emphasizes on results, that's output. The employer and the employee should be allowed to agree amongst themselves on what arrangements work best for them. This bill will make it hard for the employer and the employee to effectively respond to emerging challenges, such as those presented during the COVID-19 pandemic and the new workplace realities that are emerging. 7, the engagement between an employer and employee during and out of work hours is a management issue and should not be legislated. This should be addressed through the collective bargaining agreements and the human resource policy manuals at workplaces, according to the unique operational requirements and needs of specific enterprises. So I want to appeal to the policymakers to move away from the piecemeal amendments to the Employment Act and labor laws. We need to think of comprehensive review of the labor laws as we did in 2007. This will give us the opportunity to address most emerging issues in a way that addresses all our needs. The third one was on the repeal of the NITA Act. We note that the Presidential Working Party on Education Reforms was formed to address issues around competency-based education, governance, financing, equity, and inclusion in the education sector. The report, whose scope touched on the basic education, tertiary and university education, was handed to His Excellency the President on the 1st of August 2023. The report of the Presidential Working Party has several recommendations, which some of them need to be reconsidered. These include: 1, repealing the Industrial Training Act and merging the National Industrial Training Authority with the TVET Curriculum Development, Assessment and Certification Council, the so-called CDACC. 2, transferring the training levy functions from NITA to the proposed amalgamated funding body, the one called Tertiary Education Placement and Funding Board. 3, merging the training and assessment component of NITA with the TVET CDACC. 4, overlapping the mandate of agencies with the TVET space, therefore compromising service delivery due to conflicting and competing interests. There is overlapping of functions amongst the TVET Act, the NITA Act, the NEC Act, KICD Act, and KMTC Act. The Federation has always advocated investments in measures that create more job opportunities and improve productivity, such as skill development through strengthening organizations such as NITA to execute their mandate fully to deliver on skills development and the employment agenda. These recommendations will put employers at a disadvantage because, first, NITA has a mandate of undertaking occupational training, which is aligned to the government's bottom-up economic transformation agenda, as it focuses on enhanced productivity at the workplace through sustained partnership with employers. Secondly, the role played by NITA to facilitate apprenticeship and indentured learning will be lost if the Industrial Training Act is repealed. And lastly, the training levy fund is dependent on contributions by employers. It's not a government fund like others. Thus, the proposed merger will not serve the intended purpose of the training levy fund and will hamper industrial training at a time when relevant skills are needed in the labor market. With those remarks, we thank you for your attention, and we are now ready for any questions that you may have. Asanteni sana, and thank you.
Thank you. We'll pick some questions. You just say your name, your station, and then we'll...
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Maybe I can address, thank you for those questions actually, but I can address the the first question, which was really an overall question on the monetary policy conduct, essentially. And I think it's a global phenomenon. You see, when inflation is a threat, most policy management people, what they will do is that they will try to ensure that they create a base where the prices are down so that you can have more effective economic growth. So globally, when inflation is a threat, the monetary policy conduct responds by raising the interest rate in order to mitigate the inflation threat. Now, what is happening in the developed world is that they are also facing the same inflationary pressure, and so they are increasing their interest rates. So if you look at the Fed, they are increasing their interest rates. If you look at the EU, they are increasing their interest rates. Now, on the domestic front as well, we also had our own inflationary pressures. And so in response to that, most of the monetary policy intervention would normally be to raise your interest rates until inflation is under control, to tame it. So, and your question is the fact that is it effective in the domestic environment? Because we saw central bank aggressively increase the central bank rate, by a whole 100 basis points. And that was thought to be quite aggressive, but I think it was a necessary measure at that point in time because we saw the effect. Immediately, the CBR went up. We saw inflation beginning to come down. And the last reported inflation numbers by the central bank team when they were reviewing their monetary policy committee meeting, actually inflation is coming down and it's continuing to come down. Now, what will happen is that once inflation has been tamed, then you will see the monetary policy committee take a more softer stance. In other words, you'll see the CBR beginning to come down. And of course, when the CBR is high, there is the challenge you posed of the fact that, then we start seeing the impact it has on the non-performing portfolio, which starts going up. So it's a concern, but it's a necessary pill to have in order to bring inflation down. So I think now that we are seeing the inflation coming down and the CBR starts coming down, then you'll also start seeing the NPL from the banking sector begin to come down. I hope that addresses the... Yes, it's an issue. I think it's a necessary pain to go through in order to address the long-term benefit that we desire, which is really bringing down the prices and therefore support economic growth. Yeah. Then you asked some question about, there was the issue of presumptive tax, the issue of the national tax policy, and there's the issue of tax relief. And I think all of them are pointing to one thing, and which is a concern really for us because we are seeing more tax measures being proposed in order to raise the necessary revenue for the government to be able to meet its development agenda. Now, I think there is a need for that to be balanced with the fact that the disposable income and even the cost of doing business for the organizations and the disposable income for the common man and anybody, what is happening is that is then having that negative effect. And there is therefore need to balance the need for the government to raise the resources to be able to finance the development agenda and the cost of doing business and generally just the good, the comfort of its citizens, so to speak, and the comfort of the organizations that are creating employment and therefore providing the goods that are there for consumption. And so I think on your three questions about the presumptive tax, the national tax policy, and the tax reliefs is an issue of trying to balance the measures of the government raising resources and then, two, giving an economic base for growth.
Na maswali pale tu yakiendelea kuulizwa, wale wana FKE wakijaribu kujadili na kueleza ni vipi ambavyo tumewasili mahala ambapo tumefika kwa sasa. Baadhi ya wanahabari tu wakiendelea kurusha maswali kwa wale wasimamizi pale ambao wanajaribu kutoa wito kwa serikali na masuala kama hayo kuwa yenye kufanikishwa ili Mkenya ama aliyeajiriwa humu nchini asiwe ni mwenye kuumia sana. Kumbuka kwamba kuna baadhi ya matangazo ambayo yamekuwa yakitolewa hapo awali ikiangazia swala zima la ushuru tofauti ambazo zimekuwa zikitozwa kwa wananchi na haswa wafanyikazi humu nchini. Kwa hiyo FKE inakuwa ni yenye kujaribu tu kutaka serikali kupunguza baadhi ya zile ushuru. Hebu tusikize wanasemaje.
Thank you for those questions. So to answer the question about job creation and the prospects of that in light of all the changes that we've seen in the last few months, it requires us really to look at the structure of the Kenyan labor market, which we've talked about for quite some time. If you look at our labor market today as a developing economy, which is the same in most of Africa and other developing economies, really we are largely informal. And even the jobs that have been created over the last few years, if you look at any surveys and the outcomes, those jobs are coming from the informal sector, which is 3/4 of the employment sector for those in wage employment. So we have been seeing a reduction in the number of formal sector jobs even before the current regime came into office. The more you tax the formal sector, the more you make it difficult for those enterprises to create jobs. And we are seeing that. We've just been looking at what's happening in Nairobi and in other regions because the Federation of Kenya Employers has offices across this country. We are seeing a reduction in jobs. Enterprises having to really review their business models to be able to support the wage bill. And the taxes that we're talking about are being levied on the formal sector, which is just 15% of the total wage employment in this country. So that is the reality. And when you are under the pressure of tax, which increasingly we are, then you have to look at that. And you cannot take in more people because you can barely afford to pay those that you already have in employment. And that leads to a response to the second question about the changes employers are putting in place to contain the wage bill. We have been talking about flexibility for a very long time as FKE. We need to have flexible laws that allows enterprises to be able to manage the wage bill and to be able to keep people in jobs at the same time. So flexibility is increasingly happening. The changes that we've seen in the world of work have made it very difficult for us to have permanent and pensionable jobs or people in long-term contract types of employment. So increasingly we are looking at short-term, flexible terms of engagement that perhaps either outsources that service or takes on people on contracts for short-term or contracts for a specific task to be done. And once the task is done, then you release that person. Because if you have full-time employees, then there's so many other costs that go with that. The indirect costs, you can add 30% to your wage bill. And all this raft of changes that we're seeing in the laws that we're talking about today, whether it's looking at health, whether it's looking at training, whether it is looking at pay as you earn and housing levy, just means that there's more burden on employers and they have to come up with innovative ways to get the job done without being stuck with a fixed wage bill. So as a country, we need to have that conversation of how to support enterprises to be able to keep people in jobs and also to be able to support job creation. To do that, we need some stability in the business regulatory environment for employers to be able to plan.
Na maswali tu yakiendelea kurushwa kwake Jacqueline Mugo, mkurugenzi wa FKE, ambaye anasema kwamba mashirika yanayosusia kuwaajiri watu zaidi kazi kwa sababu ya ushuru mwingi unaotozwa kwa biashara zao, akitoa wito kwa serikali tu kuwa ni wenye kuwezesha mazingira mema kwa waajiri ili nao waweze kuwa na msuli wa kufanya kuajiri wale wa Kenya ambao wanaendelea kutafuta kazi katika nyadhifa mbalimbali za kazi. Ni kikao na wanahabari cha FKE ambacho kimekuwa kikiendelea kwa sasa, na baadhi tu ya mambo ambayo yameweza kujadiliwa pale ni swala zima la ushuru unaotozwa biashara mbalimbali ambao toa nafasi finyu sana haswa za kazi, ambapo makampuni mbalimbali yanaambulia kuwa ni yenye kuwafuta watu kazi ama hata kukosa kuajiri watu zaidi kwa sababu ya kujilinda kutokana na kufilisika kuambatana na swala zima la ushuru mwingi ambao unatozwa katika sekta mbalimbali. Kwa hiyo wanajaribu tu kutoa wito kwa serikali kupunguza udhibiti ule ama kudhibiti sekta ya biashara ili nao waweze kuwa ni wenye nguvu za kifedha, kuwa ni wenye kuwapa ajira wa Kenya na vijana mbalimbali ambao wanatafuta ajira kote nchini. Hebu tusikize tu baadhi ya majibu yanayotolewa na FKE.
Question about, I think, the balance between the taxation and debt. You know, the government normally will fund itself, or rather the government will normally have development plans on the basis of which, of course, they are elected into office. And if very promising, that's how you can win the electorate to vote for you. And therefore, you then have the obligation to deliver on those promises made through your development plans. And I think that's what we are going through in terms of the fact that there were commitments that the government made to deliver, so they have got to deliver. However, to deliver those projects or those development plans, you actually just have two sources. You either tax the citizenry or you borrow. And it's an issue of trying to balance between your commitments. Are you able to cut on your commitments and therefore sort of like break the trust or the promise that you gave for the electorate? Or are you able to then balance in terms of how much you are able to tax and how much you are able to borrow to finance your plans? And I think that's the balancing, the balance that needs to be created here. And I think your question is linked to, are we in the right balance? You see, our view has been that, and I think we have addressed the issue of taxation. We have expressed the views on terms of taxation, that the measures that are coming day in, day out, I think are on the higher side, you see. And it needs to be relooked at in the sense that it needs to be brought down to what is actually, what I can say affordable, what can be both by the corporations and by the individual on one. Now, when you talk about debt, there is a point at which you have to finance your plan through debt, and debt is not bad, but it has got to be sustainable. You see, and the sustainability of the debt depends on a number of factors. One of them is, are you going to balance between domestic debt and foreign debt? Right now, I think one of the challenges we are having, there is a Eurobond that is maturing in June next year. It's $2 billion. And the question is that, do we have the capacity to be able to repay it? Will you have the resources to repay it? And I think that's one thing that we have got to balance, because defaulting on a debt like that is not thinkable. It's not something that you can fathom. Well, restructuring can be an alternative in terms of refinancing it, but you have got to have the right conditions in the market. Because at the time when you come to restructure and the conditions are not appropriate, you might actually be getting a much more expensive debt to repay the outgoing debt. So it's an issue of balancing. Personally, I'm not particularly very worried, because I think we have got the capacity to repay it. That will not be the problem. I think the issue is just that, are we able to sacrifice the other priorities in order to pay it? And are we willing to? Because that is a political decision to make, you see. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Questions. How do you know they were He's been taking.
Na bila shaka ni Jacqueline Mugo, mkurugenzi wa FKE, na Habil Olaka, rais wa FKE, wakisema tu kuna njia mbili ambazo serikali inapata fedha zake, moja wapo ikiwa ni ushuru, nyingine ni madeni, na wanatoa wito kwa serikali ya Kenya kwa sasa kuwa ni yenye kuweka kwenye mizani ni ipi kati ya njia hizi mbili ambazo hazitakuwa ni zenye kumfinya mwananchi wa kawaida. Tupunge unyunyu kidogo, lakini usiende mbali, mengi zaidi baada ya muda usiokuwa mrefu.